lands. This meeting is being recorded, yes. Just got to push continue. Sorry about that. I'm going to go back and start again. I'd like to acknowledge that wherever you are calling in from today, we're all on First Nations land, to pay our respects to elders past, present, emerging, and any First Nations people who are in this session today, to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, always was, always will be First Nations land. And I'd like to also acknowledge that we are in Reconciliation Week, and just ask all of you for a moment to just reflect on what that means for you in your journey of reconciliation with First Nations people, with history, with culture, with country, and yeah, just ask you to spend a moment just reflecting on that. We have a pretty big topic that we're going to talk about today. Something that, you know, I think is very alive for us right now, and it certainly has been kind of always there. But I think for us, it's really something changed in the world when, you know, the re-emergence of the Me Too movement, which, as we all know, started with Tanya Burke a long time ago in her work, and more recently in Australia, where we've seen some really high-profile cases and a lot of people really struggling to talk about sexualized coercion and violence. So we were kind of having some conversations at work and really felt like this was a really important time for us to, as a sector, and as a bunch of people working in different areas of family violence work, to sort of open up a conversation and start kind of getting down to what are we doing, what are we doing well, what aren't we doing, what could we be doing better. So we've brought together a group of people today to have this conversation. We have Elena from No to Violence, who in a moment I'm going to hand over to, is going to talk about a bit of a big piece of research that she's done. She sits in our policy and research team, and really want to acknowledge, Elena, that it's hard to condense that down into 5 minutes. So really thank you so much for just giving us a little fraction of that. Sal Dennis is going to talk about the work that she's been doing, the fantastic work elevating victim survivors' voices, and how that can influence all of our responses wherever we sit, wherever we work. And then Karen Willis is joining us to convene a panel of people who are working in the space. Before I kind of progress any further, I just want to acknowledge that, you know, talking about, feeling into this work can be triggering for us. Many of us have lived experience. It's kind of that realm, I think, that many of us have felt really uncomfortable talking to other people about their sexual relationships. And we know that it's often kind of sidelined in the work. So I just want to ask people to, you know, be mindful of yourself, of your own self-care right now. If you need to have a break, if you need to turn your camera off, you know, I'm going to invite you to take good care of yourself. And if you need some support afterwards, please have a conversation with someone that you trust. Reach out to EAP, reach out to whoever, you know, you need to have a conversation with. But without going too much further, I think I'm going to kind of start this process going. We've got an hour and a half, and I think, you know, I'm hoping that we will have a really rich conversation, and there'll be opportunities for all of you to ask questions after the panel has finished. So please, you know, pop your questions in the chat, write them down, and join in the conversation. I'm going to hand over to start with to Elena.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much, Lizette, for your introduction. And yes, just to reiterate, this is a challenging topic. Rather than trying to present a whole bunch of research to you in 5 minutes, I'm going to share just some basic statistics so that we can all start on the same page, as well as share a bit of what the Men's Referral Service has had to share with us about talking to men who do or do not, based on the conversations they have, use sexualized violence in their relationships. So now I'm going to try to share my screen. And if you have any questions, as Lizette said, feel free to put them in the chat. This is just a very brief overview.
Just finding you really hard to hear. Is it possible to turn your mic up?
I can move closer to my laptop. Is that better?
Not really.
Let's see, I'll move my hair. Is this any better?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, I'll try this. So first, the definition of sexualized violence in intimate partner relationships that's used in Australia is defined as any form of sexual violence that occurs within a current or former partnership, including cohabitating and non-cohabitating partners and dating violence. This is also referred to as IPSV and intimate partner sexual violence at NTV, and more generally in our sector and in the women's rights sector, there's a move to refer to sexual violence as sexualized violence. And it's important to note that the definition of intimate partner sexualized violence includes dating violence. You don't have to be in a de facto or cohabitating partnership. Sexualized violence is globally and in Australia the most common form of sexualized violence perpetrated against women. Victim survivors of IPSV are 10 times more likely to experience multiple assaults than people who experience other forms of sexualized violence. So this is because it occurs within a relationship setting where people are less likely to report, perhaps less readily able to identify sexualized violence for what it is, and because the perpetrator has ready access to the victim survivor especially within the context of a cohabitating relationship. Shame plays a very specific and important role in intimate partner sexualized violence, and that is due in part to the humiliation and degradation that is often perpetrated as part of IPSV. This might come in the form of degrading sexual practices or using past experiences of sexualized violence to justify future or current perpetration. If the perpetrator knows that the victim survivor, for instance, has brought up the issue of sexualized violence in the past, but did not do anything to address it, to report it, then he knows that she's perhaps unlikely to do it, to report if he is to perpetrate again. An intimate partner sexualized violence is the least likely form of sexualized violence to be reported. So stranger-based sexualized violence, forms of non-partner family sexualized violence, acquaintance sexualized violence, etc. Those are all more likely to be reported. And a theme throughout this presentation and throughout this research more broadly is that intimate partner sexualized violence really challenges our conception of who is a bad guy. It really challenges us to recognize that the men that we know, like, and love may also be perpetrators of sexualized violence, which doesn't fit with the generally agreed upon narrative of sex offenders as men hiding in dark alleys. Sexualized violence in intimate partner relationships is a relatively new crime in Australia. Until 1994, it was not fully criminalized across all states and territories. So prior to 1976, a husband could rape his wife. I suppose it didn't count as rape, but could have sex with his wife against her wishes and would not be found guilty of sexual assault or sexualized violence because when a woman married a man, her bodily autonomy was given over to him as part of the contract of marriage. Criminalization was piecemeal and staggered, and it took close to 20 years from the first partial criminalization to full criminalization. These are some facts from Australia's most recent data on sexualized violence. So 1 in 5 Australian women have experienced sexualized violence. And this slide uses the phrase sexual violence and sexual assault because that is, because it's a cited work. So we have to use what they say. So that is 1 in 5 women have experienced sexualized violence of any kind. So that could be intimate partner, it could be stranger, or other forms of sexualized violence. But we do know that half of the women who have half of these sexualized violence assaults are perpetrated by an intimate partner. So 1 in 10 women would have therefore experienced, based on that statistic, intimate partner sexual violence perpetrated by a partner. 1 in 6 Australian women have experienced physical and or sexualized violence from a current or previous cohabitating partner. Physical and sexualized violence statistics are rarely disaggregated in global and in Australian reporting because sexualized violence often occurs concurrently with physical violence. So the statistic does not differentiate lifetime experience of physical and or sexualized violence. 1 in 6 sexual assault incidents against Australian women are perpetrated by a boyfriend or date, and 22% of women in Australia who experience sexual assault experience it as something that just happens rather than immediately recognizing it as a crime. And I'm sorry, I'm going to rush through this last one. I've already gone over time. The experience of the men's referral service counselors, many of whom also have experience as men's behavior change program facilitators, is that especially on MRS calls, sexualized violence is very, very rarely discussed. Men who participate in men's behavior change programs see sexualized violence as the most shameful form of violence, and it takes a long process of trust building and relationship building to engage in this specific conversation around sexualized violence. Having this conversation is particularly difficult when engaging with people who are from other cultural backgrounds where the topics of bodily autonomy and consent may not be as readily available, might not be concepts that people are familiar with. As I noted, IPSV really challenges the notion of the good guy versus the guy. The myth of makeup sex is something that was brought up in my conversations with MRS. So needing to dispel this idea that, once the kind of the cycle of violence has, in quotes, ended, that men point to makeup sex as the point at which their partner has forgiven them, they've reconciled, things go back to, again, in quotes, normal. And that makeup sex is in fact part of the cycle of violence, and makeup sex only occurs when the victim survivor is either too tired or too scared to continue saying no. We also heard in our discussions that there is some evidence that longer term men's behavior change programs, I believe that are more than 30 weeks, can build the trust necessary to have more in-depth discussions around IPSV. So in the spirit of ending on a solutions-based note, it's not impossible, it's challenging, but it can be done. And discussing sexualized violence with perpetrators requires a lot of trust and build up to create an environment where men are comfortable with this. I can stop sharing my screen. Yes, so thank you everybody for paying attention. Let me know if you have questions. I'll be here for the rest of the drop-in.
Thanks, Elena. That was really great. And as I said, you did a really good job of condensing that down to a very short presentation. I know there's a lot more in your research. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Sal. And as I said before, Sal is the director of Inside Exchange that has been doing some incredible work bringing victim survivors' voices into a space that really informs how we need to be and could be responding much better to family violence and sexualised violence. I'm going to hand over to you, Sal, and please, tell us a little bit more about Inside Exchange as you head into your presentation.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Lizette. Thanks everyone for having me, and also thanks, Elena, for that data. It's just so important to go back over that. Essentially, Inside Exchange is an initiative of Domestic Violence Service Management, which is a registered charity operating with services in New South Wales. But the work of Inside Exchange really is of national relevance, and we have national engagement and some international engagement. And essentially all it is an initiative that tries to listen to and safely and ethically publish the lived experience insights of people who may have experienced domestic, family and sexualised violence, and in quite a detailed way, so less on aggregated and analysed themes and more about who did what to whom and how those experiences are actually lived out, because often there's a bit of a vacuum on small data. And we make those insights available directly and also involve people with lived experience in our resources. And the idea is that essentially the exchange component is trying to get the whole response continuum to be really looking at lived experience and listening to what is my social responsibility in that, in what way have I been involved in, I guess, enabling or being complicit in that being someone's experience. But also, therefore, what is my social action? What can I change? Whether I be a workplace, a helpline, an EAP, a specialist service provider, or part of more of the statutory system in terms of corrections, child protection, police, and so on. And just really based on the premise that everybody in some way is responding to violence, whether that's conscious or not, and that all of us, if we're more informed, could actually be part of creating more safety, as well as working to stop violence. So I promise I'm only going to share something for 5 minutes. I've pre-recorded it because I think that's a little bit more reliable, but I'm right here and I'm part of the, I guess, the end part of the panel if anyone has any questions. This short presentation is an extract of insights and resources from Inside Exchange and is informed by the work of Centre for Response-Based Practice. My body is mine, but sometimes it doesn't seem so. Other people, even people I love or people I live with, use my body for their pleasure or their power. I don't like to talk about it, but I'd like to talk about it with the right person. I don't know how to talk about it in a way that will ensure I'm treated with respect by the people I tell. I'm not sure who to trust, but pretty sure who not to trust. I have to figure out what's next to avoid, reduce, escape, and stop the violence. So I want to know more. National, state and territory definitions of domestic and family violence and criminal codes vary. However, violence and abuse is never acceptable in any community, family, institution, place or context. What is sexualised violence? Sexualised violence is a form of violence, not a form of sex. Does what they're doing to me count as sexualised violence? Sexualised violence encompasses all behaviours used by a perpetrator to threaten, coerce, violate or force the targeted person or victim into sexualised activity. What about all the ways I've tried to say no and to make it stop? Perpetrators anticipate, suppress and overpower resistance. Whenever people are subjected to violence, they resist. How complicated is consent? Is consent one decision or many? Consent is something we're always negotiating, and so often without words. Does it count as sexualised violence if it's my partner or family? Sexualised violence is frequently perpetrated by current and former partners and family members in the context of domestic and family violence. Is it just me who feels confused about what's being done to me? Victims of sexualised violence often feel confusion, disgust, horror, betrayal, self-blame, shame and profound distress when a family member or partner has chosen to exploit their close relationship to perpetrate sexualised violence. What about sexualised violence against children? A child cannot legally, developmentally or emotionally provide consent to any sexual activity. As such, all sexualised behaviour which targets children is understood to be criminal and is inherently violent. Is it just me, or are there a lot of harmful attitudes and judgments about sexualised violence? People who experience multiple forms of social oppression are also more likely to be targeted by perpetrators of sexualised violence. Just because I couldn't stop it doesn't mean I let it happen. Dignity is central in our day-to-day lives and in every interaction. People die for dignity and they have for centuries. Decisions about safety are not always separate from or superior to dignity, and dignity is always at stake. Let's explore some of the examples of victims' resistance to sexualised violence and abuse. Every time he visits to see the kids, he sexually assaults me. I can't stop the violence, but now I'm refusing to take my bra off in each and every assault. I've been self-harming so that the perpetrator would reduce the degree of sexualised violence, as he didn't like the look of my self-harm marks. Night after night, I cried after sex. During sex, there was a painting of us both displayed in our bedroom. I would look at the painting at the time and looking at my eyes in the painting and mentally reminding myself, I have eyes and I can see you abusing me. My partner has repeatedly raped me, so I resist by refusing to take care of my personal hygiene, to make myself as unclean as possible, to protect myself. It was several more years before I told anyone. I was in my early 20s when I first told a group of girlfriends. We were playing cards. It was a rainy day and we were all sitting around in a flat in Auckland, playing cards and drinking, having glasses of wine and lots of girly banter. I can't remember the context, but I just blurted out, I was gang raped. And then went, oh my God, I can't believe I've said that. I was a nurse by then and they were health students, and they went, do you want to talk about that? And I was like, no, okay, let's keep playing cards. Wherever it is difficult to tell someone about domestic and family violence, it may be even more difficult to tell someone about sexualised violence. My Dignity, My Body is Mine is a resource for anyone who may be experiencing or has experienced sexualised violence, and for anyone who may be responding. The intent of My Dignity is to provide information, support reflection, share lived experience insights from others, and signpost to contacts and support. You can obtain a free copy from insightexchange.net.
Thank you. I just want to pay acknowledgement to every individual who contributed to those examples in there, and also to the really powerful work of the Centre for Response-Based Practice that really informs our ideas. Thanks, Lizette.
Thank you, Sal. Gosh, I think for me it really drops me into a space of being really a lot more, I think, grounded. I feel a lot more grounded about the work and kind of why we're all here having this conversation, and the importance of as you say, listening to and reflecting on the voices of people with lived experience. Thank you. And let's keep awareness of those voices in our next conversation. I'm going to hand over to Karen Willis now, who's going to convene the panel and get them to introduce themselves. And many of you may know Karen in this call. So Karen spent, probably 40 years working in the domestic violence and sexual violence spaces. She was former CEO of family domestic violence rape crisis service, and now works for Unions New South Wales and the gender equity team. So really great to have you on board, Karen, and really happy that you're here to sort of facilitate this conversation. I'm handing over to you now.
Thank you very much, Lizette. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're all meeting and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I actually haven't got our panel members up on the screen. Is that going to happen? So I can see who I'm talking to? I'm sure we'll get there in a minute. But I'm wondering, Phil, if you're there, if you could introduce yourself to everybody who's with us today.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, I'm definitely here. I wonder what view you've got on your Zoom screen, whether it's a gallery view or the speaker being pinned. Just if that's of any use or any help, I don't know. So while you're looking at that, I'll introduce myself, and I'll introduce myself by saying Jingi Walla from Widjabul Waibul country of the Bundjalung Nation in northern New South Wales, and I'd like to pay my respects as well and offer my gratitude for being able to work in this beautiful country and recognise that sovereignty's never been ceded. So I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and First Nations people here with us now. I've been involved in men's behaviour change work since before it was called men's behaviour change work. So I've been basically involved with the Men and Family Centre in Lismore since the late 90s. Well, I run a small private practice doing some consultancy work in the men's behaviour change field for organisations who are trying to get up and running, and offering supervision and all sorts of consultancy work. And I've also been involved in writing and developing and delivering programs for men who are sexually abused as children. So that's probably enough of my bio for the moment. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Phil. Yeah, but as Phil said, he's been doing this work a long time before a lot of the rest of us are actually starting to talk about it. And I'm sure he's got many stories of the changes in views and attitudes and ideas over the past 20 years. So if people want to grab Phil at some stage, I'm sure he can fill us in on those. Georgia, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Georgia. I'm speaking from Wurundjeri lands today. I am a family safety practitioner for Relationships Australia Victoria. I work with men and women, perpetrators and victim survivors of abuse. And I also work on the sexual assault crisis line. I've worked in family advocacy for about 15 years now in Australia and overseas. I've worked in child protection, refugee rights, prisoner rights. But in the last few years, I've been focused on working with women and children who are victim survivors of family violence, with during the relationships and in the aftermath.
Thank you, Georgia. And I think Georgia's a classic example of someone who's worked with a range of different services who have had different views about what their roles are in this space over a long period of time. I was commenting earlier on to Georgia, I think I would have loved to have been on the board meeting where Relationships Australia decided to move into this space. It would have been a fascinating conversation. Vincent, perhaps we can hear from you next.
Hi, everybody. My name is Vincent, and I would like to extend my acknowledgement to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, whose land I live and work on, and whose land I'm currently locked down on. It's a beautiful sunny day outside. I would also like to extend a respect to elders past and present, and to any First Nations people joining us today. I work currently at an organisation called Thorne Harbour Health as a family violence counsellor. The Thorne Harbour Health was formerly known as the Victorian AIDS Council and is a community-controlled organisation primarily working with the LGBTIQ community and people who live with HIV. In my work life, I have worked as a counsellor supporting victim survivors of sexual assault at a CASA, and I also have a background in community education, focusing on the prevention of violence and sexual assault.
Thank you, Vincent. And I think the work that people like Vincent do is something that we should all take our hats off to. It's hard enough doing work in the sexual, domestic and family violence field without the intersectionality of the disadvantage and discrimination that the LGBTIQ plus community has experienced over such a long time. So thank you very much for your work there, Vincent. And Kyalie, if we could hear from you next.
Hi, everyone. My name's Kyalie Moore. I'm the National Sector Development Manager at No to Violence. I'm a proud Wadjuri Yamatji woman from Western Australia. And I'm calling in from Yamatji country today. And I'd like to just pay my respects to my elders past, present and future, and acknowledge any First Nation people on this call today. I'm very, very passionate about ending family and domestic violence in all communities, and more specifically in First Nations communities. I've been involved in the men's space for approximately 12 years, worked as a specialist family violence court coordinator for Bundy Court, which is an Aboriginal specific family and domestic violence court in WA. And then I've spent some time as a men's behaviour change practitioner and supervisor, working in Aboriginal specific programs in the community setting as well as the prison setting. And probably more recently, I've just completed a 2-year national project working on NTV's federally funded DSS project. And that project aimed to increase family violence perpetrator accountability by building capacity in regional and remote Aboriginal communities across Australia. Now I'm working in the sector development role at No to Violence, just mainly continuing to strengthen practice and build capacity in the workforce nationally. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyalie. And I think we all owe an incredible depth of gratitude for the incredible leadership that Aboriginal women have had in this space. It was absolutely them who led the charge on saying, if we really want to prevent sexual, domestic and family violence, we need to be working with those who are using this violence and getting them to change their behaviours. And they were the first really to be starting to talk about this. So thank you very much for not only the work you're doing, but to all of your aunties and sisters and yourself who've done such great work. Thanks, Kyalie.
Thanks, Karen.
I'm going to start with Phil, and people might be aware we have got some organised questions because Lisette is incredibly well organised, and so we're hoping to be able to present a range of ideas and concepts and discussions today. We're pretty clear that we're not going to come up with answers. I'd love to be able to say that, you know, in an hour and a half, we're going to have answers to all of the problems, but, you know, if it was that easy, we would have done it by now. So we're going to work through our questions. Phil, I wanted to start with you, and what's your experience with working with men and how that relates to their sense of entitlement regarding their partner being available for sex whenever and however they want?
Thanks, Karen. I think that, you know, part of what I want to say in answer to this question is that this is a very tricky space to navigate when we're talking about working with perpetrators. And you know, if we start talking about engaging with men in certain ways, you know, I don't want it to ever feel like we're trying to take the experience of victim survivors into a smaller vision or a lesser place. I just want to be really kind of open about that at the start. Something in Elena's presentation really stood out for me because I'd written a couple of quick notes just while we were talking earlier and things like that about this. And one of the notes that I wrote was marriage vows and the idea of ownership and things like that. So my experience of working with men is that men are kind of slow to change. They're slow to grasp concepts when those concepts are quite broadly kind of put into the sector. So here we have a sector of people who are all working in this area, and lots of us and most of us maybe are working with victim survivors and understanding victim survivors. And yet what we kind of don't have with the men that we work with is they don't have any access to this, or very little access to any of these types of conversations. So you know, a man kind of has the sense that consent is something that is given. This is my experience of working with men. Consent is something that's given in a marriage vow, or consent is something that's given as an idea of, oh, well, we're dating now, so therefore consent exists across the board. And so that, that's a really incredibly entitled position. One of the problems we have is that men aren't talking with each other about that being bullshit, about that not being acceptable, about that not being okay. Men aren't actually having those conversations. So men are still in the dark ages, as it were. Back in 1976, when before the legislation came through, a lot of the men we work with still have that idea that if I get into a relationship, I can have sex whenever I want, in whatever way I want. And when we start talking about consent, there's often this idea of what does that even mean? What are you even talking about? Seeking consent. I had one guy say to me something like, "Oh, that just destroys all the romance." Just that
destroys the romance.
Seeking consent, actually having a conversation about consent, destroys all the romance. So that's the kind of thing that we're dealing with. Yeah.
Georgia, I'm wondering if you could talk about the unwritten code in relationships that privileges men's needs. Phil's brought that up, and I'm wondering if you'd like to pick up on that.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting question because I just don't feel like it's all that unwritten. I think that code is shown to us through the media, through the news, through the TV shows we watch, movies, music, and it's messaging that people are getting from a very young age. As soon as they're engaging in media, they're learning this code where men's needs, men's wants, men's desires are prioritised above all else. They're the things that are seen as legitimate. Men are getting this messaging that their cultural identity of masculinity is completely tied to the pursuit of sex. And so to reject sex from a man, they take that as deeply personal rejection, and they respond with aggression because that's how they've been taught to react through this unwritten code that we all kind of know well enough to live under. I think it also brings up the idea of understanding sexual coercion and coercive control as part of a broader thing of social entrapment, which is like a social model of family violence where the violence isn't just in the home, it's outside of it as well. And the messaging outside reinforces the violence that's happening in the home.
So I'd like that line that Phil came up with, that men are slow to change, and you were also alluding to that too, Georgia. So I
probably would think that humans in general are slow to change. I don't think it's the sole area of men to be slow. I think people are fast when they want to be and slow when they want to be, but I wouldn't see it as so gendered.
Okay. Vincent, just following on from that, I'm wondering, how do you go about bringing up sexualised relationships and abuse in your work with clients?
I think in the work of men's behaviour change, I often try to lean on values that people are bringing to the table. So I think listening out for if you can connect to a belief that a man has around something that he believes that fosters sexual respect, or really open questions around, oh, so what does sex mean to you? Or, oh, is intimacy the same thing as sex? Or I think that genuine kind of curiosity around knowing about men's lives and knowing about their thoughts, and for me, not assuming that I know everything about how they think about the world, because I definitely don't. And I think if somebody tells me what to do, or doesn't ask me about my opinion about something when they're trying to assist me to change, even if I'm being slow to change, I often don't listen as much. So I suppose that kind of trying to connect with something there that makes sense in terms of how they see themselves, how they see intimacy, and what they actually want, then gives you an idea of how you might want to have the conversation, because it might be different for different people.
So trying to find a sort of common point to start the conversation from, rather than launching into a a lecturer or a moral sort of position or whatever. Yeah, okay. Kyalie, what do you think some of the barriers are for workers to be confident and confident, like confident and confident, when they're wanting to talk about sexualised violence with clients?
I guess, you know, if we're looking at barriers, I think the very first thing to avoid or to work on is the co-facilitated relationship. You know, the relationship that you have with your co-facilitator across any topic in an MBC program is important, that you have a really good working relationship, that you both have the knowledge and the confidence to have those conversations around sexualised violence and coercive control in relationships. Lots of planning and preparation, and you know, really just taking the time to unpack how you see that session moving and how you want it to move. The ability for both co-facilitators to engage really well and creating safety in that space first, for the men to be able to feel safe to speak about themselves in that way, you know, to take off that mask and to be open and honest about their sexualised behaviours in their relationships. The ability to challenge as well the attitudes and beliefs of the men in the room. And we have heard a little bit about some of the attitudes and beliefs from Phil and Georgia and Vincent. You know, the things like the male entitlement, consent, you know, having a conversation around consent, talking about make-up sex. You know, we know that within relationships, the make-up sex is good and is what the men are looking for. And so having conversations around their attitudes and belief around what's wrong with the make-up sex mindset, and the promises that come out of that as well. Challenging the men in this space and with their attitudes and beliefs, that is the work of tapping in and turning on that internal accountability. You know, we've got that system, external accountability through the system responses, but we in the group with the men need to switch on their internal accountability so they can be challenged for their beliefs and attitudes and start to shift out of those spaces. As well as that, you know, it's important that facilitators, you know, aren't being groomed and not allowing the grooming to take place in that space, because there's a massive risk of them colluding with the men and believing their story and writing off the partner. So it's really important to be listening to their narrative, as well as listening to their narrative, you know, working out where they might be in their stages of change. You know, where are they motivated to change? Are they contemplating? Are they planning? Are they actioning? You know, listening for that. Always keeping women and children at the centre of the work, never losing sight of the women and children. They're in that room too, and you're not just their voice, you're advocating for them in that space. And sometimes, and most my experience is working in First Nations communities and in NBC programs, a lot of our men, our First Nations men, in the group disclose sexual trauma as children. And so that often comes up when we are talking about sexualised violence. And so listening to their narrative, supporting them as we can, and then referring on, you know, not trying to address that in the group, but then referring them to other professionals that can help them address their own trauma as well. So there's a lot going on in the room all the time. Yeah.
Phil, I'm wondering if you could talk to us about the socialisation of sex and how that plays out in men's thinking regarding women and their availability and their rights, and men's rights to take whatever they want and whenever they want. And it sort of links in with some of those ideas we were discussing earlier about, you know, once you're married then, or in a relationship and that sort of thing. But yeah, that how men come to that sort of thinking.
Again, it's one of those kind of strange situations for me where it feels like I'm kind of, my father's an Anglican minister, so I'll say preaching to the converted. That idea that, you know, the people who need to be involved in this conversation kind of aren't really here. Thinking about advertising, you know, just, you know, we're all kind of conscious of advertising. So to buy a Harley Davidson, what I get bombarded with in our society is a picture of a sexually available woman. Well, I want to buy a motorbike, and somehow that goes into my psyche and tells me that if I buy this motorbike, that then women are available to me. And we're bombarded with that at all times, so much so that I think most of us are inured to it. Maybe when I say most of us, I don't necessarily mean most of the people in this Zoom session. Most of the people that I work with have no idea that they're being brainwashed with this type of socialisation at all times. And so, you know, it's kind of fascinating to be working in this space, but then go out into the world and turn the TV on, and there's another message that tells me that women are sexually available to me. And one of the other issues that I think we have in this is that the men that I work with aren't talking with other men about this. You know, they're not standing up and saying, well, what's going on here? I don't think that's appropriate, or I don't like the look of that. You know, I have men telling me stories that are, and I apologise beforehand, this is not my way of thinking, but, you know, men who say to me things like, well, women are fair game. And my father told, not my father, but, you know, this is what a man has said to me in my working experience. You know, women are fair game. It's like his father told him that. So, you know, I don't want to be disheartening. You know, I want to be able to bring some hope to this work as well. But you know, these are the types of socializations that we're up against, that we're kind of dealing with. You know, we look at magazines, we look at all of the media, our movies, all sorts of things. They are all loaded with messages that tell men that women are available for them.
Yeah, I mean, and absolutely everywhere. I mean, The Big Bang Theory, one of our most, you know, current popular TV comedy shows, and it's just absolutely full of really quite appalling behaviours and treatments and discussions towards women, and just because they're computer geeks, they get away with it. Yeah, really not good enough. George, I'm wondering if you could talk to us about what you think the role of pornography might be in all of this, and how does it impact on ideas around intimacy and respect?
I think porn has an absolutely inescapable influence on how we view sex, especially, I mean, it's just so prevalent. I mean, people talk about porn like it's a healthy expression of sexuality in general culture, but because so many men watch it and defend it. But I think that the increasing violence in porn, I mean, you've got over 88% of videos have some act of male violence or aggression. It's contributing to this sexual radicalization, especially of young people, where they think this is normal. And, you know, you've got studies that come out saying that the more porn boys watch, the more they expect it to be reflected in real life. And then they drive that themselves by reflecting it in real life, by violating boundaries, by using words like kinks instead of calling it for what it is, which is sexual coercive behaviour, like forced anal sex, strangulation during sex, things like that. It's used as, that those acts are used as a Trojan horse to start introducing violence into the relationship. And porn is teaching young boys and men how to do this effectively, and it's working.
Vincent, so how do we balance the safety of workers with men in groups and have those open and honest conversations about sexualised violence when we also know, you know, as Georgia has just said, that attitudes and not only the violence that they might be using in their relationships, but that they might be engaging with all day. And as Phil has just said, often not talking to other men where those other men might be saying, yeah, nah, either making and saying terrible things, but having conversations that they're either ignored in that or supported in some of those appalling ideas. How do we do that?
I think it kind of goes back to the question and the discussion around socialization, or around the world that we're living in. You know, we live in a patriarchal system where pornography is one arm of the way that sexuality is, you know, involves dehumanization of women and of other people with, you know, sexually commodifiable bodies, I suppose. It is, you know, as we were watching Elena's presentation earlier, I was struck by thinking, you know, also, and something that Kyalie said actually brought this up as well, thinking, well, yeah, the statistics in Australia are that 1 in 6 men, cisgender men, have experienced sexual violence at some point in their life, usually when they were children, as Kyalie mentioned. That figure changes, you know, across different populations. I know that a recent study brought up that 1 in 2 transgender people have experienced sexualized violence at some point in their life. That's also quite a high number, as a statistical representation there. So I guess that, you know, balancing our safety as workers and acknowledging that we're living in this highly this world and this context where dehumanization is kind of the first step, like in reducing somebody or, you know, using violence against them. We're living in a context where people are really dehumanized a lot of the time by these kind of attitudes. So I guess that, you know, everybody's strategy around keeping themselves safe has to be very personal. But I would go back to what Kyalie was saying earlier around the co-facilitation relationship. And, you know, we're here kind of on a Zoom of potentially converted people, as Phil was mentioning earlier. But I think that that's actually really important. You know, we have to have people who we can rely on to maybe not always agree with us, but to actually like challenge us and provide some kind of feedback to how we're doing it. You know, often when I'm confused about what I'm doing, or if I feel a bit like confronted, which you often do when you work with men who have used violence, and men who feel really entitled to tell you about what they think about, you know, women and everybody else as well, actually. I think that sometimes, you know, I try and fall back on either my skills, which are like having a thick skin and being able to communicate and negotiate, and also the co-facilitation relationship. I think that those are, and I think those things should actually be kind of embedded in practice and should be embedded across organizations, and it's really important for entire teams to actually be integrated and come to, you know, events like this one. That's my long-winded answer on that.
Thanks, Vincent. I must say, just your comment about the dehumanizing attitude towards women, and it is interesting in talking to those who've experienced sexual violence. Often they will say at the point in the process where they realised what was going to happen, they would talk madly and use names and talk about family and kids and dogs and anything else, like to try and humanise themselves in the eyes of the offender. Yeah, so it's they knew intuitively that they weren't being seen as humans in that process. Yeah. Kyalie, so what sort of personal boundaries? I mean, we've sort of touched on a few bits and pieces, and I think, you know, Vincent talked about that really supportive workplace, which is, I think, something that when you're doing any sort of work in sexual domestic violence is absolutely critical. But what are the personal boundaries that we as workers need to put in place alongside with our co-workers so that we are all supportive in this work? Yeah, how do we get there?
Okay, so first of all, I'll just jump on the back of Vincent, who was going down that road. First of all, we need to have skilled and qualified practitioners in the room, for first and foremost. No one should be working with men who use or perpetrate family or sexualised violence. No one should be in that space unless they are skilled and qualified to do the work. That's a given. And once you're in that space, as a worker, you know, be careful not to overshare. Sometimes facilitators do disclose small parts of themselves and their attitudes to engage the conversations in groups. So be careful not to overshare. The co-facilitators mostly need to be one male, one female. With that, having clear roles with the work that you're doing in that space together, modelling healthy relationships, respect for each other in that space. Regular supervision needs to be taking place, and reflective practice sessions and work together. Always giving co-facilitators that opportunity to provide constructive and reflective feedback to one another. And also with your supervision, being able to talk about the things you're not that confident about. And sometimes, you know, this work is always confronting from week to week, and being able to talk to your COE about, you know, something that might have triggered you. You know, there's been plenty of times when, as the only woman in that space, in a room with a male co-facilitator and you know, 12 men in the group, some of the things that come out of their mouth is quite triggering. And so as a woman in that space, you don't jump on and follow that all the way through. You know, the challenge work needs to be done, and you've got your COE there, and you know, you've been working together for a long time. You start to know different looks and gestures and all that sort of stuff. But after group, being able to sit down and debrief with your COE and say, man, when he said that, you know, this is what happened, I had a reaction, this is what happened. You don't do that in the group. That stuff doesn't happen in the group. That's got to be used later when you have a debrief with your COE. And then address those triggers. You know, it's important for co-facilitators to know what some of those triggers might be for you, so you can sort of work together as a team if that situation comes up again. And then talking to, you know, with me, I would talk to my male co-facilitator about this is how I want you to support me in this if it happens again. I don't necessarily want you to rescue me and jump in and take over, but this is what support looks like for me, for you. So just having those real conversations, transparent conversations with your co-facilitator, and modelling, definitely important to be modelling that healthy, respectful relationship between a male and female co-facilitator, because it might be the first time that they are seeing a healthy relationship being modelled.
We are going to move to questions from participants in a minute, but I'm just wondering if anyone on the panel, because we've talked a bit about it, but that idea of people who are working in this space being groomed, and you know, and part of that is also us bringing our own stuff with us, and then experiencing grooming, and you know, I don't think any of us are immune from finding individuals who we actually, you know, as humans don't mind them, but then separate, you know, knowing that behind that the things that they've done, and then of course that makes us a little bit more susceptible to the grooming behaviours, and just constantly having to pick ourselves up, that reflective practice that you mentioned, Kyalie, so that what we can be constantly bringing back to the group is, or to individuals, ideas that really oppose the sorts of attitudes and ideas and behaviours that support the kinds of practices of the clients we're working with. I wonder if any of you would like to comment on some of the things that you think are really critically important there.
I'll go. My name is Christine. I work at Task Force. We've had a couple of times where some of the individuals would ask for counselling outside of a means behaviour change program, but they would request counselling with only the. So what we have is we've actually got a really strong policy that any counselling that is provided outside of any of our groups, and that the two facilitators cannot see the clients or the men attending the means behaviour change without on a personal basis outside of the group, because we have, and it will be very complimentary as well. I like the way that you present things. I like the way that you talk about this. You've got a really great mind around this, and I think I'd really benefit if I speak to you in this about this, and this. So we've had a few of those, and we've had to actually implement a very strong policy around that. Invitations to collude is what we'll call it. Yeah.
I think it's a good point that even though we're professionals, no matter how long we've worked in this space, we're human beings before we're family violence workers, and we are so vulnerable to things like what Christine was talking about and Karen was talking about, these invitations to collude. I mean, these men are good at what they do, and they wouldn't be getting as far as they did with it and getting to a men's behaviour change program unless they were quite effective in this kind of manipulation, impression management. And so I think as workers, we need to be forgiving of ourselves and gentle on ourselves, and also equip ourselves as best we can with the knowledge and the practice of resisting these invitations to collude.
And therefore, you know, the ongoing training and professional development, you know, needs to be ongoing all the time, and reflective practice.
And I think you mentioned supervision as well.
Supervision. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, it's critical. I mean, almost after every session, just to degroom, to get back in. Yeah. You also mentioned qualifications and so on. Does anyone from the panel want to comment a little bit more about what they think is important there, and maybe is that some of the work that No to Violence has been doing on qualifications and skills or training?
Every state has their different minimum standards as far as practitioners in men's behaviour change programs. New South Wales and Victoria, as they stand, they have probably lots of, like, the qualifications to get into MBC work in Victoria and New South Wales is a standard that I think needs to be right across Australia, because there are some states that don't have any training qualification requirements to engage in MBC work.
I think Lisette here, I think I'd agree with Kyalie, and I think also there's clearly a lot of people who have a lot of experience and incredible amount of expertise from working in the sector. So there's a really big piece of work to support that ongoing, engagement with training and workforce development and people gaining qualifications that are really relevant to the work they're doing. And I think the other thing that, which I just want to talk about, because I think it's really important that we know that this work is not everyone's gig. Not everyone, is kind of feels themselves that they've got the robustness, the desire to work with men. And so that's really important. Just give you all the gets for the work, to be well trained, but it's really personally feel equipped to do. And what do I need to do to bring myself to this space? So I'm a really strong believer that personal work is really important in this work, whether you're a man addressing, your sense of privilege and entitlement and what being, what all your kind of socialization around, your own masculinity means. Just as for us as a woman doing the work, how do we bring our experiences and often our lived experience to the work in a way that's really effective, where we can be really engaging with the men that we work with in a way that's real and that is, honest and balancing that accountability and compassion and humanity. So that's the big ask, I think, of us in the work, whatever gender we are, is to bring our full selves to the work. And then of course we need all of the backing of really solid training and supervision and everything that everyone's talked about.
Elsie, I know is gathering some questions, but I'm just wondering, one of the things that one of the panel members spoke about was in the work needing to switch on internal accountability, which I really liked. And I must admit, I sort of went off into my own little thoughts for a minute thinking about that. Oh no, come back to the group, you're facilitating it. I'm wondering if people would like to comment more about that, switching on internal accountability, about how we might do that, what some of their ideas and practices, and quick tips for doing that.
Well, I think I'm happy to start, and then anyone else can jump in. I think, with holding men to account, we can have a whole service response, pouncing on this man and holding him to account, right? He's going to do his program, he's going to do this, he's going to tick all the boxes, dot all the T's, and then go back into the relationship or what have you. But while he's going through everything that he needs to go through, any interventions, if there's no internal accountability, if there's nothing that's coming from within, and he's doing it because he's got jail over his head, or he's doing it because of, he started this, he's got to finish it. And if he's not doing the work, then nothing's going to change, right? So it's important, and that work needs to, and that's why we do need those really qualified and skilled practitioners to work with this man when he's in that group with you, whether it's 20 weeks, 26 weeks, however long your programs are going for, and for the workers to know what the roadmap is, what it looks like, what are the things that what's a narrative, what is his narrative as he moves towards those steps towards change. And when you're listening to his narrative, you as a practitioner will be able to know and hear that internal accountability and what his motivation for change is, whether he's actually planning to change, actioning his change, doing his emotion work. You'll hear him starting to respect and value his partner's views. Whereas once upon a time, she's crazy, she's on drugs, or she's lying, or she hit me first. You know, you've got all those smoke screens coming. Later, when he's starting, that internal accountability kicks in, you'll hear his narrative change. He won't be using as many smoke screens. He might be starting to say, well, my partner told me that I've started to change, and she's happy that I'm not drinking now as much as I used to. He'd be using her name, Sharon. Sharon tells me this. And so through his narrative, you will start to hear that internal accountability. He will stop blaming, he will stop justifying, he'll stop minimising, and he will start to take responsibility for his own behaviour, and he will acknowledge what his behaviours are. And, you know, you see it.
I just I'm totally agree with everything you've said, Kyalie. I suppose I'm just really wanting to bring us back into here to talk about, and we know that this can be really tricky to bring up in our conversations in group when it does show. There's a few questions here that I thought I could read out that Elise has sent through. There is a really talked about form of sexualized violence in intimate relationships. In the swinging community, there is a thing men coerce their partners into engaging in that swinging. So I'm hope swapping partners, having open relationships. Specific behaviours in the swinging community, rarely talked about due to embarrassment or shame as part of that community. How do we bring up discussions more to the table? Because I believe there needs to be so much more awareness and to address this, given the increasing rates of open relationships.
I wonder if I'm just thinking about the ways that we, having worked with a lot of people in LGBTIQ community, and particularly with gay or bi men who are using a men's behaviour change program to change their use of violence, in any different kind of like countercultural space, people will have corresponding countercultural ideas around sex and sexuality. But what I often come back to is my knowledge that the dominant sexual culture that we all live in, like a heteronormative sexual culture, is one of dominance and entitlement. And so, of course, that translates into countercultural spaces. So for this example of the swinging community, and that particular coercive control that exists in that community is perhaps particular to that community. But it's not so different from a married couple where the man expects that he has a right to have sex with his wife whenever he wants, regardless of her feelings about it. And I guess that coming back to what we know about what we're trying to do, which is to, bring a lens of critical thinking to dominance and entitlement culture, I think we can use the same conversation tools around expectations, like, okay, so who gets to decide when it's time to trade partners, or okay, so who makes the decisions about the open relationship or about use of contraception or what have you. I think they're really actually quite applicable across different countercultures.
I think it's also a really interesting question, because in my work with victim survivors, being forced into swinging is actually becoming more frequent. And I wonder if it is also connected to an increase in the consumption of porn, because cuckolding and things like that is actually quite a common theme. And what I'm seeing with my clients is that they are forced into swinging, and then they go through that with their partner, and then their partner uses that against them. Either the woman enjoyed it too much, or she didn't enjoy it enough, or if she liked X with one man, she'll do that with her partner as well. And it's one more very effective way of silencing a woman from talking about these things, like Vincent was talking about with the shame. And yeah, like I said, it's becoming a lot more common.
I'd really like to talk about the concept of ownership as well, and the notion that the men that that I work with mostly have never really thought about it, never really talked about it very much, but they kind of see their partners and their children as an extension of themselves. They own them, and they will do what they're kind of told and what they want from them. So I think, as I roll back through our conversation, I think about accountability in terms of my own personal accountability and who am I accountable to, and what am I accountable to in the work, and how do I work with a man in a way that keeps victim survivors at the fore of that work, but is actually worthwhile work for him in relation to his change process. Because I can easily keep the victim survivor narrative at the front of the work. How is that actually going to support his change process? And this is the tension that can be really, really challenging for us, having this conversation about how do we keep an engagement process with a man that keeps him engaged, keeps him willing to open all the time. Because when we're talking about some of these conversations, a lot of these conversations just aren't being brought. And so as facilitators, how do we open those conversations before somebody's ready to have them without losing them, while we're also making sure that we keep the victim survivors at the forefront of the work? And that's a balance that I just really want to agree with what's been said before. This takes skill, it takes expertise, it takes a lot of practice and training. And how are we providing that to our workers? And what does that kind of look like?
Can I just say something? It's Susan Elvery here from RA New South Wales. I last year ran one group and supervised another after COVID, well, at the end of it. And I became very concerned that we had stuff in our program, but that it wasn't perhaps deep enough to bring the men to kind of talk more. And I just developed a page of questions, and I asked them to work. I mean, we'd done a lot of supportive work, but I asked them to go to a room each and work on the questions on their own. And they did ask them to invite them to be very honest about their behaviours, their thoughts, their attitudes around sexual abuse. And then they came back together and had a good conversation about it. And I worked out that was going to work best in terms of just making it a really, there was a lot of kind of gravitas in the room about the importance of this, and that there was no giggling, there was no, I just really kind of made it very earnest, serious work that they did on their own. They weren't obligated to show their work to anybody, and they came back together and talked about what that was like and how it was for them. And it worked really well. And then the other group that I was supervising did the same thing, and it worked well. And it just seemed to be a good way of getting a much more deep and earnest reflection from the men. So yeah, I just wanted to pop that in because I think this is a good forum to say that.
Thanks, Susan. I just I'd like to kind of add on to that. It's having the courage, I think, to break. I think we're ready to break new ground in the men's work. And be more open about talking about sexualized coercion and violence. And I know, when I worked with Phil up at the Men and Family Centre, we developed 2 sessions. And those 2 sessions, as a team, it took us quite a while to get those sessions kind of tight or ready for us to be able to deliver them. And we had to do a lot of work ourselves and have lots of conversations. And I think in this work, and Kyalie alluded to that earlier, like those conversations that we have with our team, whether it's your co-facilitator, the person doing the advocacy work, your team leader, your whole team, so that when you get into the room with the men, you actually have had this, you're sitting on a rich bed of conversations. And when we got into the space with the men and we weren't sure how they were going to go with 2 sessions devoted to, sexualized violence, one to pornography, talking about, another one to consent, talking about definitions and impacts of sexualized violence within their relationships, it actually wasn't as hard as we thought. And that men really started engaging in those conversations. And it was almost like they were relieved that suddenly this kind of darkness that they were sitting with, somehow we were creating a space where they could start to interact with each other and talk about their experiences and be more honest. And so I think there's a good amount of courage that we need as a sector, that obviously has to sort of be paired with good training and supervision. I just want to take us to another question, if that's okay. I think we've got a bit of time here still. I'm interested in the responsibilities of programs and workers to manage admissions of sexualised violence in our work with perpetrators, considering systems accountability to victim survivors, and with information sharing responsibility. This is probably more than a sort of 5-minute answer, to be honest. But it is, I think, it's a big question that I know has sat with me at various times when I've been party to information from a victim survivor who's wanted us to know, when I was doing advocacy work, and yet was really strongly clear that she didn't want reports made to police. And then we wrangled, within the organisation about how we held that responsibility of that knowledge. And this was before we had information sharing sort of protocols and schemes. So any answers from the panel? And Karen, please, you have a lot of experience in this space as well.
Bill, you were going to say something?
Well, I was just going to say there's 2 kind of streams to it, isn't there? One is information that we've received from other sources, often from the victim survivor, and the other is the admission from the perpetrator or the man. So, part of our protocol is we go through a whole lot of information sharing lead up with him so that he knows that when he shares things with us. So I'm still questioning whether or not that actually keeps men from sharing information. I don't know. And the other is when we have information. So we've kind of drawn a fairly hard line in the sand that basically says when we know, we will report, and if we can, we will support the man to report. We'll engage him in that process and take him sort of down that path. So yeah, that's I can go on for hours, but I'll stop and let others speak.
I think it's tricky to balance receiving that information and then, in Victoria, we're getting new rules under MARAM of information sharing and things like that. I think the assumption can often be, we should tell the police have to know about this, but we also need to understand that that's not always the safest thing for a victim survivor, especially if she's Indigenous. That brings in a whole other host of issues, and we could be doing the wrong thing if we went to the police with that kind of disclosure from the victim survivor or the perpetrator.
And I suppose that's where the ideas about engagement with the person who's experienced the violence is really important, if they're willing to engage, of course, because then, that can be where the discussion can start as well, just what their thoughts are about criminal justice involvement. We may have time for one more question. We've got 3 minutes to go.
Jane Gold here. Just going back to that previous conversation, I think the only exception in my working life has been if the victim, usually the woman, has a disability, in particular, a intellectual disability. where her own thoughts, she could still be in a very risky situation, you'd still try and work with her to communicate and engage with the police. But if she is at risk, then that's the time when I've probably overstepped her wishes, not wanting to take power away from her, but just to keep her safe. So, you know, I'd imagine we'd all be pretty much the same in that particular situation.
And of course, the discussion with her can always be about, look, I really feel I need to take some action here. How about you come with me? So at least they can advocate for themselves as they go. Look, we're 2 minutes to finish time. So I'd just like to pick up on Lizette's discussion right at the start about the impact of this. So all of us have been sitting here for the last hour and a half, really delving into some fairly difficult concepts and ideas. And probably, I mean, we're probably more used to talking about sexual assault when it comes to those who've experienced it, but talking about engaging with those who use the violence, I think takes it up another notch. So I'd just like to acknowledge that so many of you have sought to engage and stay. I'd like to acknowledge the incredible amount of work that all of you are doing and that so many of you will continue to do. But I'd also like to make a suggestion that you know, this last hour and a half has been hard, and probably the whole day is hard. So what I'd like you to all think about is, before you go to sleep at night, something nice that you're going to do just for you to make up for the impacts that this work has had today. So I'll give everybody a couple of seconds to think about the nice thing that they're going to do for themselves before they go to sleep tonight to make up for today. Oh, there's a few smiles there, so I think there's a couple of nice things going on. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you so much to No to Violence and to Lisette for putting today together. It's certainly going to send me away with lots and lots of things to think about, and I'm guessing that'll be the same for everybody else. I don't know if there's anything that you want to finish off with, Lisette, before we finish up.
I would just like to likewise thank everyone for coming along today and joining in. I think this is the beginning of many more conversations, and I feel like we've just started to touch the surface of it. I really want to thank Sal, Elena, Karen, and the panelists for coming along. Really great to be starting this conversation. There's a lot of work for us to do to really, I think, progress and deepen our work and include this into our work in a much more meaningful way. Yeah, thank you, everybody. I'm just going to ask the panelists if they could stay on so that we can have a little bit of a debrief afterwards. So